Kevin Beets stood tall and proud for years. In addition to his dad, Tony Beets, the revered and dreaded monarch of Klondike, they established an empire together. Of power, gold, and machinery. However, the deepest cuts don't always appear. From competitors. They are from a household. Whispers started to circulate among the Yukon, too wild to be true whispers, and then the truth came out. Beets Kevin achieves Tony and joins forces with Parker for a $10 million contract. Schnabel. A revelation so startling that it left boffins and miners were in disbelief. The Beets family legacy based on iron and loyalty will, now broken by avarice and ambition. Consider it. Parker, one of Tony's biggest rivals, Schnabel, unexpectedly has an ally who is aware of every Beets operation in detail. It's more than just a bargain. It's a weapon. A treachery that can cause the monarch to fall and install a new ruler in the harsh gold fields. Furthermore, this is only the starting. The aftermath is more sinister, more profound, and far more unsettling than anyone could have guessed. However, before we get too deep into the complete background of this startling twist, be sure to turn and subscribe on alerts, because of what you're about to learn would alter everything you believed. Yeah, I was aware of the gold rush. For many years, a single name reverberated through the icy Yukon valleys and rough streams: Tony Beets. Well known in the mining industry world as the Klondike's monarch, Tony constructed his empire not by chance but by grit, willpower, and an unwavering will. He was a man who was bigger than life, admired and revered, feared and envious. Machines thundered around him. Fortunes were groaning as the dredge stripped from the earth by the overwhelming might of will. However, Tony was never by himself. His was a family-run business, and at its sharp stood his kids, Monica, Kevin, Mike as well. The Beets were more than just merely a mining operation. They were dynasty in motion. Tony's oldest child, Kevin, was regarded as the heir apparent. Monica, who was similarly tough, made a name for herself. As a bright and competent young woman in her own correct. Even though Mike helped with Shepherd's Hill was a growing machine, under Tony's strict control, they greeted a group that few could oppose. Told Beets were unstoppable, even as rivals. Takrus, they served as the benchmark that of everybody else was measured, as well as to viewers globally. They were their representation of unadulterated ambition transformed into gold. Every day, the scene hardly ever altered. Engines thundered over frozen terrain. Pay dirt poured down on gold nuggets and conveyor belts stacked under the strong northern sun. In the pans to those outside, strength, discipline, and outcomes. A devoted family advancing from season to season. The actual Paradise Hill evolved into more thanland. It developed into a monument and a fortress. To the Beets and Tony's pride group power. However, as the surface glowed with shadows and gold lurked below, Kevin, despite being perceived as legitimate heir, started to feel the unseen burden bearing down on his shoulders. Not all of his successes were his own, but giving credit for his dad's leadership. Every innovative concept conflicted with Tony's former school strategy, and each setback, regardless of how little, had his name on it. The top-off weight of the Beets enterprise, and Kevin anticipated wearing it, but only on these conditions. The dynasty's fractures were initially tiny and nearly undetectable. A disagreement was brushed aside, and irritated dignity the gaze. The unsaid conflict over a father who desired change and a kid who required compliance. However, it breaks as soon as they shape deepens. In addition, behind the wall submission, Paradise Hill, insolently, resentment grew. The Beets dynasty was powerful. Indeed, however, no imperial, no matter how powerful, is impervious to break. Soon, the quiet Woodlow confrontation to rise. Both father and son, we were on the verge of discovering being on different sides of a storm that posed a threat to shatter their world. Separate, the public and behind the camera-ass representation of the Beets family's unwavering gunity. A new narrative started to unfold. At first glance, they were dynasty, an efficient mining machine, each contributing to Tony's empire. However, after the cameras ceased rolling, as well as the sound of the equipment became quiet, the fissures underneath that it was more difficult to conceal the rugged exterior. Tony Beets has established his empire on custom, struggling, using force, and an unwavering faith in his method of mining. For him, achievement was about devotion, self-control, and regard for the techniques that had elevated him from the lowly earliest steps towards the throne of Klondike. However, for his oldest son, Kevin, the same techniques were changed. Kevin became agitated under his father's authority. He saw the future in a vision. quicker devices, creative methods, a more effective mining technique that could push significantly expanding the Beets empire. However, each time he spoke louder, it was quieted. Every suggestion was rejected, overpowered by Tony's thunderous command. What Tony believed to be preserving tradition, suffocation, in Kevin's opinion. Their disagreements hardened and increased in frequency. Disputes that used to end swiftly now continued, reverberating throughout the assertion. Members of the crew murmured about father and son yelling in the dirt at one another. Kevin is advocating for change. Tony is demanding compliance. Tony believed that the crown could not be distributed. Wearing the crown for Kevin was no longer on his father's terms sufficient. Like a fire, resentment grew underneath the surface. Kevin no longer saw himself as an assistant or apprentice. He started to regard himself as legitimate head of state, the person who could bring the Beets' reputation into a new era of mining. However, as each season goes by, that dream became more unattainable, buried behind the burden of his dad's shadow. It was a conflict between vision and control versus ambition and tradition, and only one could ultimately prevail. That the father and son were silent, thickened, the strain turned into intolerable, and gradually, Kevin started to look past Paradise Hill to find chances of his own. The meetings were planned, discussions conducted quietly in nooks and crannies out of his father's grasp. Betrayal whispers started to circulate, initially quiet, then getting louder with each day that goes by. Due to the fact that this was no longer only a disagreement, it was the start of a rebellion. And shortly Kevin Beets would be revealed to Yukon. Was willing to take the unimaginable action. Its secrets never remained hidden in the Yukon forlengthy. The icy terrain could retain its gold tight, but rumors spread fast past the taverns, back roads, and mining camps roadways, and shortly after, those murmurs started to go around Kevin Beets. Initially, it was merely minor observations. The disappearance of Kevin from Paradise Hill in several hours, or even days. He was observed at places distant from the familiar certain, getting together with persons that nobody called peaceful location. From the outside, it could have appeared innocuous, but to those who were aware of Beets' family, these silent happenings were concerning. Kevin was a son who grew up surrounded by the Beets empire. His life was meant to be about in the vicinity of the family company, the operation, and most importantly, devotion to his dad. Anything beyond that orbit had once raised suspicions. The rumors quickly started to circulate like wildfire. The miners murmured about Kevin's annoyance, his desire for independence, his wish to at last take from behind his father's imposing shadow. The tales become more daring with each time it is recounted. Kevin was scheming, something that might alter everything. Then a name appeared. Shock waves were delivered through the Yukon. Schnabel, Parker. The concept was unimaginable. Tony's biggest adversary, the publicly fought against and ridiculed the man. He viewed the young miner as a rival, instead of being on an equal footing. For Kevin to even but Parker was in the same room with Shazardis. When he engages in negotiations, it was not holy. The camps were humming with incredulity. Tony's own son might actually be siding with the adversary. However, the whispers resisted dying. The night following the increased in volume at night, coming from a claim after claim until they were unable to no longer be disregarded. Kevin, the devoted king's son, the heir, was getting ready to carry out the unimaginable. Keep your distance from his father's business and inner themes of the sworn enemy of his father. This was not idle chatter anymore. It was the start of something far bigger, the early repercussions of a treachery that would tremble the whole Yukon. Additionally, as Tony stayed in the dark, not knowing the building storm just out of his grasp, Kevin has already begun to take the actions that might change his family's trajectory for it. Due to the fact that once they hardly fade, they construct, they assemble your strength, and eventually, they burst into reality, and that truth will soon become apparent in the most startling as much as possible. As Parker and Kevin Beets Schnabel was ready to make an agreement that would alter the distribution of power in the forever Klondike. Initially, it appeared like nothing. Only two miners are crossing routes in the Yukon. Schnabel, Parker, and Kevin Beets casually exchanging words, a handshake here, a laugh there. The thought was harmless to the inexperienced eye. Competition converse, staff interact, and the mining industry is sufficiently tiny that interactions are inevitable. Nobody hesitated, but below the surface, there's something far more dangerous was starting to take form. Parker, piercing and unrelenting, acknowledged the chance when it presented itself ahead of him. Kevin wasn't your average miner. He was raised by Tony Beets as his son, within the by Tony Beets as his son within the B. Beets Empire's center with awareness that there are many guys on the playing town, understanding of the ground, off weaknesses and secrets. Parker saw more in Kevin than a competitor. He noticed leverage. Meanwhile, Kevin was engaged in his own conflict. Years off laboring under the strict control of his father had made him agitated, looking for liberty. Tony had a huge empire, but it was oppressive as well. Every action Kevin made, each choice he attempted to influence was defeated by the monarch of Klondike. Then Parker arrived, young, ambitious, but open to allowing Kevin make his own way. For the first time, Kevin caught a peek of the freedom. What started out as informal discussions but quickly evolved into a plan. Behind closed doors, in private consultations, away from a deal was made under watchful eyes. An incredible $10 million collaboration was formed, based on ambition rather than loyalty. With Kevin's familiarity with the Beets business with Parker's unwavering determination, the Twa thought they could change the mining power forever in the Yukon. It was an agreement, silently sealed. No public announcements, no public exhibitions of loyalty. Two men, one breaking free, the other grabbing the chance, united by a common goal. However, as the alliance became more powerful, one man was still in the dark. Tony Beets King, the founder of the empire, their father, whose name alone was significant to the Klondike. He had spent decades of battling adversaries, defeating assertions, and safeguarding his family supremacy. He never once dreamed that the biggest danger wouldn't materialize from within, rather than from outside his walls. The Yukon has a history of storms, angry, aggressive, and unforgiving. However, the one that is currently being built would be different inside the Beets Empire. Any Tony had encountered, due to the fact that when blood is the source of betrayal, it slashes the deepest. The storm Tony feared eventually arrived. The majority would escape, shattering his empire, putting his family to the test, and imposing Klondike King into a battle for survival. Not only for power. Tony Beets is furious. According to the Yukon. Previously, the ground runs dry, machines break, and men are fallible. However, nothing in contrast to the tempest that caused that the day he discovered the reality. Word got out. Quick. Whispers verified what had previously seemed unimaginable. Kevin's outblood had established a partnership with Schnabel, Parker. For Tony, this was by treachery. This was humiliation. The Klondike King was not undercut by his heir, not an adversary. The empire he had constructed it using grit, sweat, and sacrifice shuddered now at its base. Crews remained silent while Tony's rag boiling over. His voice roared through assertions. Orders sounded, tools slammed. The fury of a man after spending conquering the harsh Yukon for decades of snow, he turned against himself. Tony, all of Kevin's choices, each covert encounter with Parker was a back of the knife. The one thing his pride, above gold itself, he carried, had been injured. Fire followed that wound. He hadn't clambered to the summit off to ridicule the mining industry, to usurp, to observe the removal of his crown. However, this was not your typical power struggle. It was family. Mike and Monica stood in the line of fire, caught between devotion to their dad and the ties off blood with their sibling. Each heated transaction was in danger of breaking up not just staff. Nevertheless, the core of the surpasses dynasty. For the first time in years, fissures that were once the murmurs are opened for everyone to look. According to Tony, Kevin was now son who had worked next to him was no longer there, braving harsh winters and never-ending dredge runs. He was a rival, a traitor, a man who had the courage to oppose the dynasty in which he was born. Additionally, if Kevin thought he could leave unharmed, he had misjudged the intensity of his dad. Due to treachery within the family wasn't only about Beets, it was a conflict. The Yukon was going to observe a fight that isn't between miners built among generations, between a monarch reluctant to cede his throne and a son is adamant about taking his spot. And when the Beets empire fell apart, one question still stood. Would there be a family conflict? Demolish them all, or even create something its ashes are more dangerous? The response would accompany the storm's arrival. The effects are never instantaneous. It percolates like poison, slowly moving through the veins of an empire. Additionally, the Beets family fallout from Kevin's treachery was not just a second. It was a reckoning. Mike Beets and Monica Beets were the cornerstones offspring by their father's side, now discovered themselves enmeshed in a conflict they didn't desire it. To support Tony entailed betraying their brother. To supporting Kevin meant going against the father's wishes, who had created their universe. Each meal, every encounter, Every hushed conversation bore the burden of suspicion. Theon's a stronghold, Beets' home was currently a battleground of conflicting allegiances. Even the crews sensed it. Men with worked under Tony's supervision for years now paused, uncertain about which side office to rely on. In the Yukon, survival is loyalty. However, when the very family causing you to fall apart, even the ground feels beneath your boots. Not sure, the camps were filled with whispers of treachery, anxiety, and conjecture. Would the dynasty of Beets center this division? Or has it already happened? Broken, unfixable? For Tony, that goal was no longer the only reason to fight. It was about protecting a person's identity. Legacy that he had fashioned from frozen ground and harsh winters. Each and every command he issued now had a hint of despair. An obligation to remind his team, and possibly himself, that he remained the monarch of Klondike. Meanwhile, Kevin Onlai pushed further into his partnership with Schnabel. Parker, the more he shoved, if the fracture is more repairable, Bacon. It was more than just a son now separating. A son was revising it, going forward, in line with his father's greatest adversary, shifting the equilibrium of ore from mining in the Yukon. The wounds forming now would be difficult to remove. Trust had been broken, and family ties had been broken, and a dynasty after no standing on shaky ground, unshakably ground. However, fractures in the Yukon Arabian personal injuries, their chances. Additionally, Tony battled to maintain his empire. Parker and Kevin were already together, preparing their next move, a daring strike to permanently change the future. Since this was more than simply a family split, this marked the start of a conflict of power that would reshape the lines of the whole mining industry, and Yukon would soon experience the full storm's weight. Was released. In the Yukon, power is not solely measured in legacy, but in ounces of gold. Additionally, when Parker and Kevin Beets shook hands, Schnabel was not just unconquered. An earthquake occurred, a seismic movement that shook the bases of mining power throughout the earth. Competitors who have observed the Beets dynasty rule has persisted for decades. In shock, in bars, around campfires, and the murmurs in the frozen claims disperse. Some referred to it as the start of a new empire, a daring alliance that might surpass everyone on the pitch. Others observed it as the demise of an established one, the dissolution of a family that was formerly thought too unalterable. The alliance was a weapon to Parker, Kevin's intimate understanding of the beating's procedure. He unexpectedly acquired advantage that no competitor could match. Dig a hole fat before appeared impenetrable was now susceptible. Previously concealed weakness under the influence of Tony's power were made public. For the first time, Parker was merely Tony Beets' rival. He was in a position to pass him. However, for Tony, it was more expensive than tactical. It was intimate, taken away from his successor. The man who ought to have brought his name and legacy with him into Thetany now had to deal with not just the next generation treachery, but the fight of his life. Parker and Kevin's every action threatening to undermine the empire. Held into Bill, the monarch of Thetany by strangers, Klondike stood in the corner, but through his own blood, the actual Yukon appeared to hold its breath. Crews tensed up. Being aware that the tranquility would not last. This was more than a simple rivalry. It was war, a battle for supremacy, pride, and the very future of northern mining. And Kevin thought he had liberated himself, and Parker thought he had discovered his best friend. The reality was much more hazardous. The act of betrayal was finished. However, the repercussions were just getting started, because in the harsh Yukon, authority there is always a cost. Additionally, as empires shook and alliances solidified, one thing became evident. This territory would hold the kings for a short time. The Yukon was permanently shook. However, the real storm, the conflict that would determine its destiny, was only going to